So when apartheid officially ended in South Africa back in 1994, there was this huge dream of a brand new, fully integrated, equal society. And one of the biggest battlegrounds for making that dream a reality? Well, it was the classroom. Today, we're going to take a look at what actually happened when the school gates were finally open to everyone. It's a story of really high hopes, some pretty complex realities, and the long, tough road from just sharing a space to truly belonging. And to really get to the heart of this, you have to listen to the students themselves. This quote from a high schooler just says it all. In primary school, we were all friends. Now that we come to high school, some whites say, no, they can't hang around with non-whites. It hits you, right? It shows this painful truth that, yeah, changing the laws is one thing, but changing what happens in the hallways, in the lunchroom, that's a whole different story. And that disconnect? Well, it comes from a really deep history. Okay, so to really get the scale of the challenge that the new South Africa was facing, we've got to understand the system that came before it. Let's start with Section 1, the shadow of apartheid, and the deeply unequal education system it was built on. I mean, look at this. This wasn't just an accident of history. The apartheid education system had a very clear, very disturbing goal: to train Black South Africans for what the government saw as their place, as laborers, as servants, in subordinate roles. It was this massive, deliberately fragmented machine with 19, that's right, 19 different education departments, all split up by race, all designed to keep that racial hierarchy locked in place. And if you want to see how that worked in practice, all you have to do is follow the money. Get this, in 1993, just a year before the end of apartheid, for every 4,700 rand spent on a white student, only 1,440 was spent on an African student. That's more than 3 times less. So this wasn't just a social idea. It was a system of inequality that was funded on purpose by the state. And then everything changed. 1994 arrives, and with it, a wave of new laws and brand new hopes. So for Section 2, let's look at the blueprint they created for what they hoped would be a truly equal future. You can just feel the ambition and the hope jumping off the page here. This is from the preamble to the South African Schools Act of 1996. It talks about a system that will, quote, redress the past injustices, combat racism and sexism, and all other forms of unfair discrimination. I mean, the goal wasn't just to put kids in the same rooms. It was to build a fundamentally different, a fundamentally just society right from the classroom up. So what did that actually look like on the ground? Well, the new law took 3 massive steps. First up, they created one unified system, merging all those 19 separate departments into a single one. Second, admissions were thrown wide open. No more corporal punishment, and no more admission tests designed to keep certain kids out. And third, school became mandatory for every single child between the ages of 7 and 15. On paper, at least, the entire legal structure of apartheid education was officially torn down. So the laws were passed. The hope was in the air. But what was the reality? What was it actually like inside these new, mixed classrooms? This is where our story gets a whole lot more complicated. Researchers from the South African Human Rights Commission went into these schools to find out what was really going on. And the very first number they came back with was, well, it's a gut punch. 62%. That's how many students, both Black and white, said that they had either personally experienced or seen a racial incident at their school. And behind a number like 62%, are real people and deeply painful experiences. When researchers asked one student to describe what that racism felt like, their answer was just 3 words: feeling like a non-human being. Wow. That tells you this wasn't just about arguments or hurt feelings. It was about attacks on a person's basic dignity. As the researchers dug deeper, a really clear pattern started to emerge. What was happening in most of these schools wasn't real integration. It was assimilation. The unspoken rule, the expectation, was that the new block students had to be the ones to change, to adapt to the existing culture of these formerly all-white schools. The school itself wasn't really changing to meet them in the middle. And the data on who was actually in charge totally backs this up. Look at the teaching staff in these schools. Even as the students walking the halls were becoming more diverse, the educators were still overwhelmingly white, 78%. And just for context, the term colored here is a distinct identity group in South Africa, historically referring to people of mixed race ancestry. And that imbalance went all the way to the top. The school governing bodies, these are the groups of parents and community members who make the big policy decisions, they were also disproportionately white at 73%. So even with new students coming in, the core power structures and the culture of the school, they pretty much stayed the same.
So what did all this feel like for the kids day to day? Well, one student described it with this absolutely perfect metaphor. They said, "We mix only in the classes, but outside, it's a zebra crossing, only black and white." It just paints such a clear picture, doesn't it? Kids were sitting next to each other because they had to. But the moment the bell rang, everyone retreated back to their own separate groups.
All right, so all of this brings us to the core idea that kind of unlocks this whole story. Let's get into our final section, the huge, huge difference between desegregation and actual integration.
Let's break this down, because it's really important. Desegregation, that's a mechanical process. It's just about putting different groups of people in the same building. It's about physical proximity. But integration? Man, that is a whole different ballgame. That's a fundamental change. It means changing attitudes, changing policies, changing the entire culture of a place so that it's built to include everybody. One is about sharing a space, the other is about building a new community together.
So when you put it all together, the research had a pretty clear conclusion. South African schools had achieved desegregation. The laws worked on that level. Kids from all races were physically in the same schools. But that much, much harder work of true integration, of changing hearts, minds, and the very institutions themselves, that work was either just beginning, or in a lot of places, it just wasn't happening at all. And that leaves us with this really powerful and honestly still very relevant question, not just for South Africa, but for any society trying to heal from a history of division. If simply opening the gates and putting everyone in the same room isn't enough to create real equality, then what is?